In this video, I'm going to show you how to take your slide guitar soloing beyond pentatonic scales. We're going to look at 5 ways to use chord tones. I'm going to do this over E7 and A7, so the 1 and the 4 chord, but I'll also discuss how you could apply this to the B7th chord so you could play this over a whole blues. I'm an open E tuning, but all the concepts we're going to talk about apply to any tuning. So what are chord tones? It's just another word for an arpeggio. It's the notes in the chord. So for a major or minor chord, it'd be root 3rd, 5th. For any 7th chord, it'll be root 3rd, 5th, 7th. And beyond that, if you're looking at 9ths, 11ths or 13ths, the chord tones are still just the root 3rd, 5th and 7th. So why are they important? Well, they spell out the sound of the chord, and it means that if you're targeting chord tones and referencing those, you're getting the most out of the chord progression. So what can we do with chord tones? Well, essentially, it allows us to strengthen that melodic line, to make our solo stand up on its own, and to weave your way through a chord progression in a musical way that makes sense. It will totally transform the way that you play if you've only been playing by ear using pentatonic scales up to this point. If you stick around to the end, I'm going to share a bonus tip that will help you take your chord tone soloing to another level entirely. So number 1, finding chord tones. Do this by visualizing the chord shape. So I'll take 2 shapes. I'll take an E7th here, and I'll take an E7th up here. Okay, so a 6th string root shape in this tuning, and a 5th string root, and then A7th will be here, or here. So that's the 6th string root, 5th string root. You can extend these a little bit further, for instance, that you can also extend that there. Same with the E7th. Or if I'm playing E7th here, I can also put the flat 7 on top. So basically, the more chord shapes you know, the easier it is to find where the chord tones are. And although you may know this all theoretically and know what the notes are, know that it's E, G sharp, B, D for your E7th chord, that's not going to help you in the heat of battle when you're trying to improvise. What will help you is to be able to see the chord shapes and then to be able to play off of those. So that's tip 1. Number 2, guide tones. So which chord tones, there's 4 of them for these dominant 7th chords, which chord tones are the most important? I would say the 3rd and the flat 7th in this case. So over E7 it's the 3rd, or here. It's the flat 7. Those 2 are incredibly important. The 3rd tells you whether the chord is major or minor, which is fundamental. And the 7th tells you, is it a dominant type chord, or is it a chord with a major 7th, or a natural 7th interval? So this is very important as well. And those 2 notes spell out the sound of that chord. The root and the 5th are less important, usually because the rest of the band are playing them already, and or it's usually pretty obvious, even if they're not playing, where that root note is. So the 3rd and the 7th are the ones to target. Now they lay out quite nicely on the guitar. The 3rd and 7th of my E chord are here. Here's the 3rd, here's the 7th. When I go to the 4 chord, to the A7th chord, the same shape just moves down a fret. 3rd and 7th. Now they flip round, this is 7th and 3rd, but it's the same physical shape moved down a fret. So you can play that in a different way here. You could have 3rd and 7th, moving down to the A chord, 7th and 3rd. It's the same shape. And this applies anywhere that you have this pair of intervals. So when you have the guide tones anywhere on the guitar, if you have it for the 1 chord, like for E7, you just need to move that same shape down a fret for A7. So I'll show you how that can work just over a loop of E7 to A7. Here's the 3rd, and just drop it down 1 fret for A. Here's the 7th on E, just goes down a fret for the A chord. important that we have this shape that can just move down. Up here, 3rd and 7th, move down to the 3rd and 7th of the 4 chord. And then the final point on that is if you want to extend it to the B7th chord, so you're playing a blues in E and it's E7, A7 and B7, you actually just move 1 fret up from the E chord. So here was E7, 3rd and 7th. If I want to go to B, I just move that shape up a fret. So basically the same physical shape. If we start on E, goes down a fret for A for the 4 chord, go back to the E, goes up a fret for the 5 chord. And it works for all the shapes where you can find a 3rd and a 7th. So this is really, really important, and it leads us on to the next tip. So tip number 3 is that semitone movements are incredibly powerful, and we can use that shape that we just learnt in tip number 2 to help us with that. So anytime that you can reference a chord tone on one chord and then drop down a semitone for the next is very, very powerful. It's the smallest movement, but it's very, very strong. So you should aim for that kind of movement and hear what that sounds like. So I'll just demonstrate that. I'm going to start on the E. Moving down the semitone. Third on E. We'll play up here. It's my E chord. So what I'm doing is I'm building my phrases around 2 notes basically. I'm thinking, okay, on E7, say I target the 3rd, well then I want, when I go to the A7th, I want to drop down a semitone and that will give me the flat 7 of the A chord. So again, that small movement is super, super important and incredibly powerful. Tip number 3, chord tones first, scale second. This is very, very important, and most people get this the wrong way around. I have so many students who come to me who say, well, I've learned all these scales, but I can't improvise, it doesn't sound very good. And the reason for this is that the secret is to outline the sound of the chord first and then add the scale around it, rather than the other way around, because what happens the other way around is you've got 7 notes to deal with, you've got to learn what they all sound like, how they all interact, and generally speaking, it's much, much harder to do it that way around and takes way longer than starting from notes that sound good on the chord already and then broadening out from that. So, if you're thinking about your arpeggio, the chord tones, so here's my E7th arpeggio, root, 3rd, 5th, flat 7, and what I can do is I can add other notes from the scale around it. Now, there are a couple of ways of thinking about this. In this particular video, I don't really want you to have to learn a bunch of new scales. I will add something in now that might be useful, but you could just stay in the pentatonic scale. Okay, so basically you're adding extra notes from the pentatonic scale. What you have to remember, it depends whether you're using major or minor pentatonic scales generally, but assuming you're just thinking like E minor pentatonic over a blues, then you can add in these extra notes. Some of them are contained within the scale already. Let's just look at the E7 and the A7th chord again. So this 3rd is not in the pentatonic scale because the 3rd is minor in the pentatonic scale. So it just means that you've added a note into the pentatonic scale that works. But basically you can add other stuff from the pentatonic scale around it. So that's what I'll do now. I'll just stick within the pentatonic scale, add these other colours from the scale, but I'm focused on the chord tones first. So I added a little bit of blues scale stuff in there as well, but the idea being that rather than learn a whole bunch of other scales to do this, what you end up doing is just targeting the chord tones and just thinking within the broader scale for the rest of it. So aim for the chord tones first and then broaden out into improvising using the scales that you already know. Tip number 5 is there are other notes that you could use as well as the chord tones. So this is where I'm going to stretch things a little bit, but I'd prefer that you think of them in terms of intervals rather than another scale. So disclaimer that once you add all these notes together, this does become another scale and it becomes the mixed Lydian scale. You don't need to know this. You don't need to think about modes and get confused with all that stuff. If you want to think about it at all, just think of it as a major scale with a flat 7 instead of a natural 7. If none of this means anything to you, don't worry either, because I'm going to talk about it in a slightly different way. So basically we have our chord tones. We have root 3rd, 5th, flat 7th, and you can add a 9th, an 11th and a 13th to that. So again, the resources for this are free and they're available on onefingerguitarist.com. I go back to the chord tones. So we've got root 3rd, 5th, flat 7. What we're going to add in now is a 9th, which is an F sharp note in this key. We can add the 11th or the 4th, and we can add the 6th or the 13th. So we've got the 2nd or 9th, which is F sharp. We've got the 4th or 11th, which is A, and we've got the 13th or the 6th, which is going to be C sharp. So these are additional colours that we can use on top of the chord tones. So if we think about the chord tones, we also have these notes here, and where they occur in any octave. So what this allows us to do is add extra sounds into what we're doing. We can still think about the pentatonic scale, we can still live within that, we target the chord tones, but we've got these other sounds that we can use. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to improvise thinking like that. I'm going to be thinking chord tones and then adding in extra colours, and these extra colours are movable. So you know, that shape that I just showed you here is up here as well for the A chord. There's the root, 2nd or 9th, 11th or 4th, 13th or 6th. So it's the same deal when we move to the next chord. There's the 13th. Here's the 6th. So the thing to do here is really get the sound of the chord tones first, root 3rd, 5th, 7th, really get comfortable with them, starting with the guide tones. But then you can start to explore these other sounds, and the way I would do that really is, I think, to start, just add one in at a time. So if I've got my E7th chord, I want to add in the 9th, say, just kind of incorporate it as one extra sound that you can play around with. And then once you're comfortable with that sound, then you could do the same with the 11th and the 13th. And as I say, once you've done this, when you have all those notes available, you've actually built up a mixed Lydian scale. However, this is a different way of thinking about it. Rather than just going, I must learn a mixed Lydian scale, what you've actually done is built it up logically from here are the notes in the chord, here are the extra colours, which are called extensions. They're extra notes in the scale. And then you've actually made musical sense of it, and your ears have had time to catch up and understand how these notes work. Okay, here's a bonus tip. Here's how you take your chord tone playing to the next level. And what you do is you introduce chromaticism. But you do this in a particular way. What we're going to look at briefly here are what are called approach notes. So what you can do, if you take, for instance, the third on your E chord, rather than just playing the third on its own, you could play the note a semitone above, and then come into that note. You could play the note a semitone below. You don't need to know the names of these notes or anything. It's basically just going, okay, semitone above or semitone below. Let's start with that, and I'll play that over the chord progression. That's semitone below. Now I'm going to do a semitone below the 7th for the A chord. I'm going to do a semitone below the 7th for E. Semitone below the 3rd for A. Semitone below the 7th for A. I'll do a semitone above for E. There's no heavy theory here, nothing like that. It's simply take the chord tone and play a note above or a note below. And what we can also do is combine them, so we could go above and below. We do that on any of the notes, but I'm just going to focus on the 3rd and the 7th still. You do it on any of the chord tones. Let's do it over the track again. Okay, so above and below. Above and below. Up here. And you can take this process further. You can do a semitone above and 2 semitones below. You could do 2 semitones above, 2 semitones below. Really, that's where it kind of starts to break down when you go a little bit further than that. But basically, if you imagine you have your note in the middle that you're aiming for, any combination of the 2 semitones above and the 2 semitones below, so 1 above, 1 below, 2 above, 1 below, 1 above, 2 below, it's just a little formula that you can apply to any of these chord tones, and suddenly you've introduced all these extra sounds into what you're doing, but you're still focused just on the chord tones. So you're not learning new scales or anything like that. It's just logically adding in a sound on top of the chord tones. It's a ton of fun. You'll hear, the bebop guys, Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, Charlie Christian, Thelonious Monk, etc., etc., doing this all the time, and it's a really useful way of expanding your chord tone playing and taking it to the next level. I hope you enjoyed this. It was a lot of fun to put together. Please give us a thumbs up, comment below if I can help any further, and subscribe so you can find out about more stuff that I'm doing. Happy sliding!